All right, everybody out there in YouTube land. It is I, your fearless host of Role Player with 1,000 Faces. My name is Matt Yancik. I'm the head game master here at Manufactured Myth and Legerdemain. And every week or so, or maybe 2 weeks on the program, I do like to bring you really cool artists, writers, creators, painters, all kinds of cool creative people that are involved in the role-playing and storytelling scene. And I really appreciate you showing up tonight to watch our program. Or if it's not now, it's the now of later as you watch this in a, well, I was about to say rerun and show my age, but as you watch it streaming later on YouTube. So I really do appreciate you coming on to watch the program. So if you're interested in following us in any way, shape, or form, most recently I have started a Discord for Manufactured Myth and Legerdemain, and you can find us at that address and in the links below. We are also on Facebook and Twitter, and please do think about subscribing to one of those little things. Think about hopping in there and getting involved, because we have a lot of really cool things coming up in the next few weeks. I'm sort of working ahead here to plan and plot things out, and I'm very happy to announce that actually just coming up at the end of the week, or maybe the beginning of next week, on Sunday, I'm super excited for the return of basically of GMs in the Machine. So basically, GMs in the Machine is a show in which I sit down with a different game master, and together over the span of 2 hours, 3 hours, 10 hours, whatever it takes, we design a game. Usually a one-shot. We go in to focus on the setting. We usually go in to focus on characters and building NPCs. And with each guest, of course, you get to a little glimpse into someone else's someone else's way of creating for their own games. So hopefully you will tune in for that. And I don't know if you caught that there, but my guest for this coming Sunday is going to be none other than Anthony Fernandez, one of the three wise men of the Cypher Unlimited channel. They have just gotten back from GameholeCon, where, from what I understand, they did, I'm not sure how many interviews it is, but if you've been watching their channel, they've been doing a lot. So check it out. And I hear, well, I can't really say anything, but they've got a couple really special ones coming up. So please do check that out. Following that, next week, I've got another interview with Daniel Kwan. So he's an ENnie Award-winning podcaster and a writer for Asians Represent podcast. He's also a designer. He worked on games settings and books such as Candlekeep Mysteries, Motherlands, Avatar Legends, and Dark Archive. So I'm pretty thankful for him coming on next week. And I'll tell you something, folks. On other channels, 2 really cool guests would be enough, right? We just stop right there. You're like, oh, we got 2 guests. We got everything covered. But here at Manufactured Myth and Legerdemain, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We have one more person coming on later on November 8th. We have none other than Lil Red Dot, and I hope you could hear the apostrophe in the little there. She's a storyteller, a host, she's a game designer, and most recently, she has become the content production manager at Kobold Press. So that's like nothing to sneeze at, folks. That's really nothing to sneeze at. I have a buddy, you may have seen him game mastering here on the channel, Steve Canaris. He loves Kobold Press. He swears by Kobold Press, and he would be so jealous and just to hear that someone else worked their way up into the big leagues. Not that she was in the little leagues. She's always been in the big, but you know what I'm saying. Went to Kobold Press. So please do tune in for that. But you know what, folks? I can tell that this is going on for way too long because my mother is texting me and saying, Matt, just get to the meat and potatoes of the program. You didn't come here for advertisements. You didn't come here for me to give some soliloquy about what I'm going to be doing for the next couple weeks. You came here for Ian Lemke, legendary and talented tabletop role-playing game writer and designer. We have him here on the program. He's poured himself into the bandwidth of Zoom in order to make it all the way here, all the way to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to be here tonight. So he's going to be talking about his experiences in the industry. And if you might have heard, he's kind of in on like a little thing called Changeling the Dreaming, and he's kind of in on a little thing called the Expanse Roleplaying Game. I don't know. It's a very small little independent game out there. He's worked at Green Ronin, but I'll tell you something. That's nothing compared to what he's doing now. And as you know, I'm very much into bringing people onto the program that I find interesting, creators that I think are doing something really cool. And recently, when I was kind of surfing through the Changeling the Dreaming group on Facebook, this was a few weeks ago, I heard the news that he was writing and designing a new game and kickstarting it, and it is currently in progress. I think it's only got a few days left. And when I saw that, and this is no lie, I jumped on it, and within about 10 minutes, I had backed it. The game is called Nevermore. It's a tabletop role-playing game of American Gothic horror, and it's inspired as an English teacher. Take a look, folks. There's going to be a little tear coming down my cheek. It is inspired by writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, Edith Wharton, Henry James, and Ambrose Bierce. So we are very, very glad. I am very glad to have him on the program. Without further ado, Mom, here is Ian Lemke. Ian, I'm so sorry to make you sit through that.
Oh, totally fine. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
It's awesome to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on the program. I do appreciate it. I know that you've been making the rounds and you've been doing a lot of interviews about Nevermore, and everybody's really excited about it. I'll try to make this as painless for you as possible. I'll try.
I'm sure it'll be great.
We'll see.
It'll be
so Ian, could you tell me? Can we start maybe at the beginning? Is this how you envisioned where you would be? When you were a child, were you creative, and had you always been kind of set on doing something like designing games, writing for them? If we went back and looked at little Ian, what was he aspiring to do?
I don't think little Ian ever really considered, or even teenage Ian really considered the possibility of writing for role-playing games. It seemed so like, these are people who do this, right? And how could I ever do that? Though, I mean, I had bigger aspirations when I was younger, and in some ways, I guess. I think the thing I wanted to do when I was really young, I wanted to be an engineer on the space shuttle. That was my dream. I mean, like watching the first space shuttle launch and everything was just, one of the biggest days ever for me. And then of course, watching it blow up was a horrifying day. But yeah, that was sort of my father was an engineer, and an electrical engineer, and watching Star Trek and everything growing up, I just wanted to do that. That's what I wanted to be.
Is that what you ultimately pursued, or did you kind of not go in that direction then? Did you sort of veer off and start in with the writing and designing, or? Kind
of started to go that direction and quickly realized that math is not my friend. Much better writer. So, I was doing a whole lot better in my English classes than I was in my math classes.
I totally know that feeling. I can say that I'm kind of similar to that.
Right. Yeah.
What do you think it was about engineering that really appealed to you then? What was it that kind of caught your attention with it?
I think it was just it really more than the engineering aspect. It was the wanting to explore space, like go somewhere new, beyond our Earth. And they do that now with writing and writing games, right? So, I guess in a sense, I kind of did fulfill that dream in a way, but in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if particularly, I assume that Nevermore is maybe 100%, well, 95% you from start to finish with some obvious help from maybe other like from artists and maybe layout and design people and things like that.
Right.
Is it sort of, do you sort of see role playing design as kind of like another form of engineering in a way?
I guess it is in a sense. I mean, when you're creating systems and that sort of thing. Well, though I will say I tend to get help with the math aspects and the probabilities. People to talk to about that. Or people who have people to be able to discuss, okay, well, what happens if you have this many cards or dice or whatever, and what are the probabilities there? So I go to the experts when it comes to that sort of thing, but I sort of create the basics of the mechanics and then fine tune based on feedback from people who know better than I do.
Interesting. Yeah, I actually, again, like I sort of feel like I'm very similar in that respect. I think I'm able to get like the broad strokes down, but then the fine tuning and the math and things like that, like even when it comes to just like designing a combat encounter or something like that, designing a monster, I am constantly like, I'll do my refining and my playtesting as I'm playing the game with my players. Like, and then I'm like, oh my God, I put 60,000 hit points into this and it really should have had like 500. I got to crank it down.
I mean, I guess I feel I've gotten pretty good. I mean, of just having a gut feeling for things because I've done it so much. After a while, you just sort of get a sense for how something is going to turn out. I mean, I might not know the actual percentage probabilities in my head, but I have a good sense for, okay, this is going to happen enough, or what have you.
Was there anyone or maybe anything, and I guess you mentioned specifically the space shuttle, but was there anything in particular or anyone that was influential to you as a child? What was it? The space shuttle? You mentioned it. Was that an accident or?
Well, I guess probably my secondary thing that drew me was puppeteering, and Jim Henson in particular. I was a huge Muppets fan and such. So and even in Sesame Street and everything before that when I was younger. I think I dedicated part of I have a dedication to Changeling to Jim Henson and Changeling.
There is. You're right.
Yeah, which I slipped in, even though I was told not to. But
no, I think that's awesome.
Yeah, so I guess that was my secondary, and again, it's sort of storytelling, right? Because you're creating characters and such, and then bringing them to life. The two very different aspects to myself, I guess. One wanting to go out to space and be a scientist, and the other one, wanting to put puppets on my hand and I used to do puppet shows all the time when I was a kid.
So I'm looking at the second page. It's I forget what it's called in like book terminology. Dedicated to Jim Henson, whose inspiration continues to return us to our childhood. And to Neil Gaiman, who tears aside the veil to show us our hidden dreams. I remember you. So you mentioned the space shuttle. I remember where I was. I was in Mrs. Jones's 6th grade English class when it was destroyed, and then later on, I remember when Jim Henson passed away. Not much, maybe 5 or 6 years later, I think it was, and I was on yearbook crew, and this is funny, but I had actually said, for people that we need to have, like people that had passed away or people that had accomplished amazing things, I had fought to have Jim Henson put in our yearbook for that year. He was one of the featured people. So are you still like into puppets at all? Like the engineering behind them, the mechanics behind them? Did you build puppets?
Really, I used to make a lot of them when I was a kid, but even up through early teens. But I don't know, that sort of fell to the wayside with other things. But I haven't actually like made a puppet or anything for ages. But but it still fascinates me. I still enjoy it. I mean, Dark Crystal is still one of my favorite things, and I'll watch all the behind the scenes and how they do it and how they bring them to life, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's still an interest, but just not something I physically do anymore.
Was role playing at that time a part of your life at all? Was that in?
Not initially. I mean, I guess, yeah, I guess so. I'm just trying to think of the crossover because, yeah, I did puppet shows and stuff, from, like anywhere from 5 to 10, 12. And I was I was playing D&D at 7. So, yeah, I guess I did crossover. And at that time, I don't think I ever thought about the intersection there of that you're basically playing a character, right? When you're doing a puppet show, but it did. I mean, that intersection is definitely there.
What was it at that time? Like, if you were to look back on yourself, what was it maybe about playing a different character or playing a more fanciful character, like a Jim Henson character or whatever, that appealed to you? I mean, I have friends who just enjoyed the combat or they liked the adventures or whatever. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds more like you were into the character aspects of it than others, because you're building puppets, you're creating, the new character itself. What do you think appealed to you about?
I'm not sure what the opposite of a min-maxer is, but that has always been me, and that I'll create characters that I don't think about what is going to be the most effective or whatever. I do what I have an idea of who this person is, and I try and bring them to life through that. And even if that means hamstringing them in some way that someone else might not. Yeah, I mean, it's very much for me about the characters and about the story. I mean, I quickly, fairly quickly became more or less a forever DM, as they say, or forever game master. But I mean, I still play from time to time, mostly because I feel I should, because I need to see things from the other side, from the player side of things. If you just game master all the time, you kind of get a little bit of tunnel vision on how things should be or work. And so I want to see it from the player's point of view. But yeah, for me, it's just been about inhabiting a different role and being someone else. Not necessarily, I won't even necessarily say a better other self, because characters with flaws and issues have always appealed to me. Not necessarily too great of flaws, but things that you have to overcome during the course of a story. Which on the other hand, telling a story, I like you do the same thing where you're creating obstacles for the players to overcome and their characters to overcome.
So then, I guess in that respect, so I guess you've kind of answered. I usually ask whether someone's a GM or more of a player, but it sounds like you're more of the GM. So if you're creating these, you'd said you're not sure what the opposite of a min-maxer is, and I guess I'm not either, but I would say like subtlety, a subtle character, right, like a more nuanced and textured, realistic character, because if you look at my stats, I don't particularly excel or bomb at anything. I'm very much in the middle. And I think that's true of most people. Do you think the stories that you create when you're game mastering might be as kind of nuanced and textured, or are they more dramatic, or what sort of a game would you?
I would say they vary fairly widely, actually. Especially if it's a campaign. I've sort of gone into running my games a little more episodic, in the sense of I'll tell a complete story arc in a session 2 or 3, and then another story arc and another story arc. one of my longest running games recently was Star Trek Adventures, and I actually named the episodes and everything,
Cool.
and it made them very much a Star Trek episode. Now of course they continued like a campaign, but and they were interconnected, but it would definitely have their own feel of this. And I've sort of brought that to other games too. Partly because when a campaign goes on and on and on forever, sometimes you don't know when it's going to end or if it's going to end. So if you have sort of like little endings throughout, at least if it sort of fades out at some point, you at least feel like you did something, you completed, a story. I think I lost the question there.
No, that's okay. No, I was asking, and you did answer the question. So I had just been asking, like, if you're creating, it seems to me that you create very nuanced characters. Are you creating equally nuanced stories? And it does sound like you are. What do you think?
But then I have a big bombastic ending too sometimes, where there's a huge, whatever.
Right. And I think it doesn't, to me anyway, I don't think endings have to be bombastic necessarily in the sense of, in the sense of giant explosions or the world changes or whatever. I think, I mean, in my opinion, and maybe it's like you were saying, having tunnel vision. I think that often I have bad tunnel vision because I play with a lot of my friends constantly, and they're the people I really prefer to play with. And sometimes I get thrown for a loop when I play with like a group of people I've never played with before because I'm doing things that might not necessarily work with them. So the idea though is that I think that's wonderful. I think the idea of not having big bombastic kind of endings and focusing more on character is a great thing. And I think it also shows it shows in Changeling for sure. It's my personal, maybe that's why it's my favorite World of Darkness game. But like, I think it shows in your work. What do you think then makes, like, what makes a good game master or a good, if we're going to talk about game masters, or a good player to you from your own personal viewpoint?
I guess the top thing for both is remembering that it's a collaborative experience. That as a game master, you're there to facilitate a story. That you're an entertainer. You're there to sort of bring this world, whatever it may be, to life. Whereas with and that's just as important for players, and I think that sometimes gets forgotten, where sort of players are given carte blanche to make whatever character they want, and players need to remember that they're part of that contract as well, that they need to make a character and play a character that fits within that world and that story, and that I think that's, like I said, I think that's something that gets forgotten sometimes in the but at the same time, that game master should never be adversarial. It should be a collaborative thing, at least as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I always want my players to win. I don't ever try. I maybe went through a phase in my teen years, but generally speaking, I've always been about having a good story and a good ending for the story. Now, there might be bad endings along the way, but the end result is the players winning generally.
Yeah, and I think the joy, well, for me again, the experience, the joy of the experience and being in the moment. I mean, winning to me is convincing myself for like 3 or 4 hours that I am this other person on this other adventure in a way. I mean, winning and succeeding or whatever just is kind of like icing on the cake, maybe.
Yeah. And that's the other thing players, I think, need to remember too, is they don't need to win every encounter. That like sometimes failing and the bad guy gets the upper hand creates a more fun story in the long term for everyone. It's not the game master trying to beat you up or anything necessarily, and it could be, but assume the best. But that I mean, if you look at movies and fiction in general, the heroes usually fail at several points along the way.
Right.
James Bond always gets captured, right?
Yes. Yes.
But then it comes out. But then he comes out ahead in the end, it's hard sometimes as a game master to replicate those moments. I remember I mentioned James Bond specifically. Ran and played in a James Bond role-playing game for a good long time way back when, and it was always so hard because I as a player I loved it if I got captured or something. That was great. That was but other players often did not like that. They wanted to always win. Win every encounter. And,
right.
Again, it's something both sides need to consider. So.
So then how is it? So if you were mentioning that you like to sort of prepare, or you like to create 2 or 3 episode arcs, and then you string those together and you still get a good sense of like having accomplished something if the game sort of doesn't finish. How do you go about preparing for your games? I mean, I'm trying to think. There could be 2 ways for a game designer. Either you've got it all in your head, so you're like, this is easy, I can do this in my sleep. Or you completely do it, or you go crazy with it. Or maybe somewhere in between. How do you prepare for your games?
I probably am the over-preparer. Well, it also comes from having run LARPs a fair amount too, in that I will spend way too long making text props and and things like this to give to the players, and then doing timelines of how things are going. Games when I feel like there is nothing, you sort of part the curtain really easily, and there's nothing back there. But and then some games, there have been times I run completely off the cuff,
right,
and just go,
right.
It depends what I'm doing. But generally speaking, I'm an over preparer. I'll spend longer preparing for the game than I do running the game.
That might be the engineer in you, making things triple redundant, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
So then do you have a particular, when you're running the table itself, is there a particular approach that you take, or is it just sort of like, I mean, do you have an approach? Would you say you have an approach? Is there a typical way that you run a game, or?
I guess my approach is to try to make everyone comfortable and enjoy the game, and enjoy being there. I want which is difficult sometimes. You can't always please everyone, but I try to at least, make. I guess my approach is to try to make everyone comfortable and what's your character doing? Even if the player is sort of sitting there quietly, really try to engage them and bring them in. Oh, this NPC comes up to you and does this. If I notice they're sort of not getting involved. So yeah, I think just trying to be entertaining and make the players comfortable and enjoy the story. I guess that's the best I can really say on that.
No, I think that's a great answer. I really do. I think it's important to make sure. I think a lot of people sort of say a toxic GM kind of attitude is like, oh, it's sink or swim. If they're not going to speak up, it's their game. They're wasting it. But I really disagree with that. I feel like it's also our job to do a healthy amount of helping and help to, facilitate situations where that quiet player can participate. There's some people that maybe just enjoy listening, and that's totally fine. But I'm talking about the player that wants to play, but is just too nervous or can't quite figure it out or whatever. So I agree with that.
That's why to sidetrack completely, I really have come to dislike games that award XP for role playing. Because it seems a natural, right? Or bonuses or whatever, bonus die or whatever. It seems a natural thing because it's a role-playing game, but the reality is we're all very different. And I find that at a table, the people who just are the most naturally bombastic, the most natural personalities tend to get all those XP or bennies, while the person who might be paying attention to everything and taking notes on everything and really involved in their own way,
right,
and that is maybe even the one to solve the the mystery or whatever, because of that, doesn't get all those things because they're quieter.
Yeah. Yeah, people contribute in different ways, and I think it's important as a game master to be able to identify that and not sort of fall for or go for the same old thing every time.
Right.
So when was it then? If you loved Jim Henson and puppeteering, and you loved the idea of building them, you're playing role-playing games, you were interested in engineering. And we may fast forward here a lot or maybe a little bit, but when was it that you decided to sort of go professional with what you're doing? There had to have been.
I didn't decide.
Oh.
Well, I guess sort of. It started with LARPing actually, because Mind's Eye Theater, Masquerade was my first gig at White Wolf, both as a freelancer and then developer.
So is that where you hopped in? Was you went right to White Wolf at the beginning?
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. I hadn't done anything before, professional before then, but a friend of mine, Mike Kinney, and I had played in this LARP, first time ever. It was a Shadowrun LARP that some friends at Johns Hopkins ran, and it was amazing. It blew my mind. I had never experienced, even played tons of role-playing games, but I'd never experienced anything so immersive as that. It took me a bit to get over it, and frankly, it changed me entirely in a lot of different ways. And so I wanted to do this. I wanted to bring this to other people. And we were like, well, what are we going to do? We looked at the Cyberpunk game that was kind of like the Shadowrun game, and then Vampire the Masquerade had just come out, and we were like, this is the perfect game for a LARP. So we put it together, and basically made a little convention of a vampire LARP, rented a hotel and and all this. And invited the folks from White Wolf to come up. I just got a wild hair towards the end. I was like, why don't we invite them? And I was like, I'll write them a letter. Nothing came of the letter. Didn't hear anything back. So I was like, oh, heck, I'll call them. And so I called, because you did that in those days because we didn't have email,
right?
That sort of thing.
I remember those
days. And it was either letter or call.
Yeah.
And Mike was like, "You're gonna call them, really?" Yeah, sure. Why not? What can they do? Say no?
Yeah.
So, but I got Wes Harris, and he was like, "Oh my God, yes, we really wanted to come up for that. That sounds really cool."
That's awesome.
And we were like, "Really?" So a bunch of them came up in a van, drove up in a van, and came to our little 200-person Vampire Con, which we had no idea that no one was running LARPs that big at that, especially parlor LARPs that big at that time. And a few people were like, "You can't do that. You can't run a game for 200 people."
Yeah, that's awesome though. That's what was that like? Because I remember I've been to one LARP in my whole life, and it was actually at a hotel like you had. So when I was I went to school in New York City, and a buddy of mine knew about LARPing, and he's like, "Man, you got to try this out. This is so great." And he loved World of Darkness, and he just sort of told me, he was like, "Oh, what's it like to set up a LARP like of 200 people, like when you're just sort of starting out?"
It was, well, the first year was 200. The second year was 500. Yeah.
Oh.
It was insanity, because we wrote characters we actually wrote characters for everyone. You could, if you registered early enough, you could submit like concepts that we would then work in, and we had coterie sheets, and we had character sheets, and then like all of your contacts and your goals in the game, and all this, and they all interacted. And there were some like big goals that like everybody was sort of trying to do, and then everybody had personal goals and everything. It was an immense undertaking, and many days of staying up till like 3, 4 in the morning writing.
Yeah.
Um,
I can
and
only
printing
imagine.
out on dot matrix printers, which
Yes.
just took forever.
That is so funny. That's great.
Imagine taking a minute per sheet. You know,
Oh man, yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's just like buzzing like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that so that was your first contact with White Wolf. Were they did you stay in touch with them? Is that how it sort of came about?
Well,
and they said, "Oh, can you write up some stuff for us?" Or
they really liked what we did with the LARP. And basically at the end of the convention, Mark Rangan pulled us aside and we're just like, hey, we're actually in the process of writing a LARP version for Vampire. Would you all like to be involved in that? Because you've done a really great job here. Now, what Mind's Eye Theater was completely different from what we did. We had a very different system from that. But we ended up, they ended up having us down to Atlanta. There was sort of a design conference of about a dozen people or so, where we spent 2 days in a room just spitballing ideas and how to make this thing work. And then Mark ran a little LARP for us using what sketchy rules they had at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And at night, and we did that. And then we were assigned portions of the book to write. From there, we did that freelance, and then finished doing our writing. And we're like,
wow, sure. That's amazing. What was it like to just sort of flip? It's kind of like it's like when it reminds me of when like George Lucas tried to make the effects for Star Wars in the early like the very first Star Wars, and he took the effects around to all these special effects. At that time they were only at studios. There were no companies, and everybody turned him down and said it was impossible. And then so he said, okay, well, I'll just hire a bunch of kids that are fresh out of school and they don't know that it's impossible, and I'll just tell them to do this. And they basically did it. So you go from being this kid that plays games to doing freelance for White Wolf. I mean, was your fate sealed at that point? Were you like, I'm going to be in gaming forever, this is what I want to do?
I mean, we hoped. And I will say there were a lot of people who helped us. We had props people who made props for the LARPs, amazing props. Like we had a monolith thing made out of polystyrene with stuff carved on it in different languages on every side, and then a lot of people helped with the writing. I mean, Mike and I did the bulk of the writing, but there were definitely others, and there were honestly a few hurt feelings that we kind of ended up leaving, because we were looking at doing these LARPs because they were taking off so well. We're like, oh, we could just keep doing this. And honestly, we probably would have made more. But
I was going to ask, did you actually make money at it, or was it kind of like breaking even?
No, especially the second year with 200, it was, we made enough to basically to pay for our expenses and front the next one. But the one where we had 500 people, definitely we made some money, which actually helped us out when we moved and took our job at White Wolf, because we were splitting one salary. They were like, well, we have one slot open for one person to develop this. And we're like, well, can we do it together? Like, well, we can split your pay.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
We'll figure that out.
That's a nice, loyal way of getting your foot in the door, I think.
Yeah. I mean, yes. So once they had us develop it, we were like, oh, can this go somewhere? Yeah. And then they started talking about, well, if the game does well enough, we could see about hiring you all. And of course, we're excited about that, and that's where we ended up. And that's that story.
I love that. It makes me wish I'd gone to more LARPs, or maybe started a few of my own back in New York. But this is a huge question, a question that requires a huge amount of reflection. Looking at that very first LARP that you kind of set up on your own, and the mechanics that you designed for it, and maybe comparing that to what you do, say, now, and everything that you've done in between, what would you say makes a good, like, well-designed system? Yes, that's a very big question. I'm just throwing it at you. What do you
Sure.
think?
I have thoughts.
Oh,
And I know they aren't always popular.
excellent.
Like, I am a firm believer that a system can support a setting and should. I'm not a big fan of generic systems in general. There are some that work better than others, and they especially work better if they're at least modified when they go to a particular setting. They make some changes to adapt to that setting and make it feel more like that setting. But when they're just completely generic, and I mean, I love D&D, don't get me wrong, but the whole let's use 5th edition to do everything
Right.
trend. I mean, there was one recently where let's use 5th edition to play Cyberpunk 2077.
Yes, that was the
anime.
weird one that was
like,
going around. Yeah.
Really? There's a game made by a guy
Called Cyberpunk 20. Yeah.
That's where it came from.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
So I like systems that support game settings, and I feel that can be very important. So that's my feeling on that. That's probably the best answer I can give on that. I mean, the initial LARP stuff that we did for Vampire, when we were adapting it, I mean, that wasn't so much creating a new system as, I mean, it's sort of adapting the tabletop game to LARP. So, I mean, it was a new system, but it was trying to replicate that in a LARP setting without having to roll dice.
Yeah.
So that doesn't really count in that way. But everything else since then, I mean, and one could argue the World of Darkness system, I mean, it does use the same system for all the different games, but it sort of goes with the thing I was talking about, is that each one has its own subset of rules as well that are adapted to that particular game.
And I think it's fair to say that I've sat down and looked at some of it, and I've talked to other friends that play that are more into different, like I'm into Changeling. I have friends that are into Vampire, friends that are into Mage or whatever, even though I love them all. And we've kind of compared, and I feel like I think you're right. It follows some basic parameters, but it's the balance is a little different in each game. I feel it's been tweaked to suit the settings in a way,
skill checks work the same. Damage generally sort of works the same, but that works differently depending on what you are.
Right. I was gonna say, like, werewolves can kind of clean up, like in a lot of different.
Right.
Yeah. If you mixed them, it's weird because it's a little bit of a shame, but it's also, to me, okay, because to be honest, the setting and the atmosphere around it is what grabs me about it, and I don't know. I mean, I don't. I wouldn't hold people back, and I always like to help people kind of have a fun time and play characters that they want to play, but I really feel like each game kind of has its own flavor, even though that word is overused a lot, but it really has its own flavor and its own atmosphere and its own look and feel, and I would want to sort of preserve that in a way. It'd be like, sometimes it's fun to mix genres, but I feel like each one kind of has a different feel to it that I would want to preserve.
I feel like you can combine almost any two of the World of Darkness games. But if you start to just all of them, it becomes a little muddied, and difficult. But I mean, you can do a werewolf changeling game, or a changeling mage game, or a vampire werewolf game, or whatever. But when you start throwing a third one into the mix, and it gets a little weird.
Yeah. What so speaking of World of Darkness and you kind of diving in and going pro, in my opinion, and let's be fair here. So what do you think? In my opinion, the World of Darkness is probably one of the turning points, like the emergence of the World of Darkness and the White Wolf games and things like that was a real turning point for role-playing games. And it sort of injected something into games that really might have been thought about or might have been sort of attempted, but they really changed them. Can you tell us a little bit about being part of that era of design? Did you just sort of come into White Wolf taking it for granted that RPGs are about like these dramatic systems and like that, the dramatic kind of aspects, or had you already kind of like experienced, what was that like at that point?
Overwhelming.
Yeah.
I so much in my life changed in that period. I mean, yeah, I went from zero, I don't even say 0 to 60, 0 to 120. I prior to working at White Wolf, I was working in a movie theater.
That's a big change. Yeah.
Yeah. And getting by. I got married like in the first year or so there. Just life changed just completely. So I don't know that I was as aware of how the game impacted the world as I probably should have been.
Yeah.
Just because my own life was so, I was like, oh my God. And I was terrified. I mean, here I am, a kid, I mean, I'd done nothing professionally before this. I mean, we did do the LARPs, which was something, and that was sort of the trial by fire, right? Of being able to churn out all this material as fast as possible and make it enjoyable and a lot of things like that. But I still didn't feel like I'd done anything actually professionally. I didn't do except for just the freelance for Mind's Eye Theater. But so I think I probably wasn't as aware of that as I probably should have been. I sort of was focused on getting through day to day at work or day and night at work, because we worked long hours there. It was not uncommon to come in at 10, but stay till 1, 2,
right?
Kind of thing. So don't feel bad about getting there at 10.
So then, how do you think that? So sometimes, like, I look back and I think about how my first few years of teaching were at a certain school, and I had a certain set of kind of like values and methods and approaches kind of hammered into me. Not necessarily in a negative way, but it was very formative because it was like there was this generic block of clay, and when you come in generic and at your first job, like they push and they really reshape you. And after that, I sort of feel like there've been a lot of fine sort of modifications done, but I'm basically that rough shape. Do you feel that coming in into role-playing design at White Wolf shaped you in a way? Do you sort of still see the DNA of White Wolf in you when you design now, or
absolutely. I mean, there are some sort of sensibilities to just design aspects that, I mean, you'll see in Nevermore. And there are some definitely reflections there. It being Gothic horror, yes, but that's also something that was near and dear to me, having grown up in Baltimore. I had a lot of the Poe stuff around me. I kind of grew up stewed in that. And also in collaboration and learning how to work with people. We sort of taught ourselves some of that doing LARPs and doing the Mind's Eye Theater and LARP stuff before that. But it was my first experience as really as a boss. We have multiple people working for us on the conventions, and But yeah, I mean, Changeling particularly was, as I said, we had a design meeting for Mind's Eye Theater, or like 15 of us or whatever in a room, all spitballing ideas and sharing ideas, and we had to incorporate all those. And so that was my first experience with that. And then brought that to Changeling with, brought in, there were all the people involved with that. I mean, it was, myself, Mark, Sam Chupp, and Jackie Cassada and Nikki Ray, primarily, but the other developers there, had their own inputs as well. So yeah, I definitely learned a lot, and there were just things that have stayed with me since then.
So when did the first rays of Changeling sunshine begin to appear on the horizon? What's the origin of your involvement and your work with Changeling?
I remember first seeing Fairy advertised in the back of Vampire the Masquerade, because it was originally going to be called Fairy, and I was just thrilled to death, because besides Gothic horror, fairy tales and fairy lore were huge parts of my life. I can't tell you how many hours pouring through. My dad had a copy of Brian Froud's Fairies book,
right?
And I just used to every time I was over there, I'd take that out and go through it. I mean, and I'm not gonna say just as a kid, that was up into my late teens and 20s. So that was super exciting. And then I remember the first time we talked about it, we weren't actually, I don't think we were actually at White Wolf yet, but it was at Origins, and Mark and I sat down, and he talked. We talked about it. And he said, "Well, we're doing this thing. It's going to be called Changeling, but now, and would you be interested in being involved in that at all?" I was like, "Yes," and so I kind of latched onto it as hard as I could from that point on. Like, I'll do anything. Tell me what you want me to do.
What did he put? So what did he say? Just go ahead and.
No, we were down. I mean, it wasn't even. It was like just a figment at that point,
right?
And then we were down there working on Mind's Eye Theater stuff by the time Changeling came around, and then so I was involved with the original, the early conversation. Like I said, there was a whole group of a bunch of us that were involved in that, and then and I weirdly, I do not remember the moment it was said, yeah, you'll be developer for Changeling.
Yeah.
I don't remember that,
because I was just going to say, isn't that like a really big thing to I was thinking like you were still fairly new, or had you been there for a long
a few months.
Ladies and gentlemen, miracles can happen.
Yes, they can.
Or they did happen at one point. I don't know if they're going to happen to you, but a miracle at one point has happened. That's wonderful. It's like fate, to use the name of but it's
yeah. Oh. I've thought about this a lot, actually, and talked to people about it and stuff. And part of me is like, oh, I was really lucky, right? But on the other hand, we also did a lot to get there. We weren't trying to get there, but we did a lot to get there.
Sure. I mean, they must have. They must have seen something in you,
right,
that they felt was particularly suited. Like, I'm thinking this romantically in my head. It's not necessarily always true. Sometimes they're like, well, Ian's free, give it to him. But it sounds like, this is going to be another title in this immensely popular line. I have a feeling they're not going to just throw it to somebody that they don't think is suitable for it, or isn't going to do it justice, or doesn't have the mindset for it. So there must have been something that you showed them and that you proved to them that made them kind of like think Ian is the person for this game.
I mean, whether it was my excitement and enthusiasm and fair amount of knowledge in the area, and then I think I'd have to go back and ask them really what they saw, but I think doing those conventions was a large part of it, because they saw two kids from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who managed to pull together these things, which that's a lot. It's a lot of work, more than we even thought. It more or less consumed our lives for 2 years, and I think they saw that we could do that. And I know me as a developer, when I'm hiring people, seeing people who I know can do something and do it on time.
Yeah.
That's half the battle.
Yeah.
Are you good? And is your writing going to be appropriate to this? And all that comes along as well. But the first thing is, can you do it?
Right.
Can you actually get it done?
So you say you use the title developer.
Mm-hmm.
Had you ever been a developer before? And then, so it's your first day on the job as developer. What do you do? Like, what do you start doing? Like, or is it a slow kind of transition into developing it? Or do they say, okay,
No.
Monday, 8 a.m., let's get to work?
They wanted books out fast at that point. I mean, there were times in that first 3-4 months or whatever where we were like writing 10,000 words a day, which is insane. I can't even imagine doing that now.
Yeah.
Now I'm lucky if I get out 1,000 to 2,000, on a good day. But we didn't know we couldn't do it, so I guess we did it.
That's what happens.
We dove right in writing new books. Like in the first week, I guess it was they wanted to do the book of props or whatever it was, and we were working on that. And then in the midst of that, they were trying to do a book deal with HarperCollins, and they wanted us to run a LARP for all the HarperCollins editors down in Florida. That was weird. And there were like 50 of them. So we had to write and run and go down there. And we had to write the thing in a week. And we oh, can you do this by next week? What? Come on.
That is so interesting. So were they trying to were they looking for licenses to
Yeah, they were looking for, they were looking to have HarperCollins publish White Wolf novels, because they were trying to get in. I think there was a deal that went through for a little while there, but yeah, it was trying to, and also writing a LARP for people who never played games at all before. Actually a couple of them turned out had, but most of them had no idea what they were getting. So we had to kind of simplify it. And, so we were doing that while trying to write a book and trying to hire writers for other books. And of course, I'd never hired anyone for writing stuff before.
What at that time then? So you're looking back again, in retrospect. So you say that, you feel that a lot of the stuff that you learned and were maybe trained in and maybe just fell into at White Wolf, you carry with you even to this day. Sure. Was there a writer or artist or creator there, or just that you were mixing with and knew from another publisher or something that was particularly influential to you or talented maybe in some way that kind of impressed you? Or
Bill Bridges was something of a mentor. He was the developer for Werewolf, and Sam Chupp was invaluable. I couldn't have. I don't think Changeling wouldn't be what it is without his input and influence and influence on me. He just had a way about storytelling that was unique. I had kind of a hard time. It's very much that compassionate storyteller aspect that I was talking about. He just when he's running a scene, you feel like you're the star. He has a way of doing that, and through his writing as well. So. So the two of them at White Wolf were probably the two who sort of taught me the most. But everyone impacted me in one way or another. Certainly Mark Reinhagen, and Stuart Wick, and then Phil Bricado and I used to have a lot of jam sessions after he joined.
So then later on, and ladies and gentlemen, I do research on my subjects, and I stalk them on the internet before talking to them, and I've been trying to put together the pieces of your life here and the places that you've been. So I won't say anything about some of the stuff I found, but I do want to ask you, when did you end up at ZeniMax Online? You are the second. You're the second RPG tabletop RPG creator that I've talked to. The other being Bill Slavisek. when did
was
did that
awesome.
happen, and how did you hop over from
I
paper to digital?
A good friend of mine ended up working. He'd never been in computer games either, but he ended up getting hired by a company called Icarus Studios in Cary, North Carolina, doing a game called Fallen Earth. It was an indie MMO called Fallen Earth, and it was actually Lee Hammock, who unfortunately we just passed away a few weeks ago. He's actually younger than me, so but that was quite stunning. But I was in between everything at that point. I was no longer at White Wolf and sort of floating, trying to figure out what I was going to do next. I was too burned out on the role-playing game industry at that point to really stay in it. I tried, and I was just like, I can't do it. It was been a little too burned, but he ended up hiring a lot of people from our circle and such. So we made an MMO with a bunch of people who'd never made computer games before. So once more, I jumped into something I'd never done, and ended up working there for almost 5 years. And we did launch the game, and for being a little indie MMO, I mean, it's actually still out there.
Yeah, I was going to say
they recently rebooted it. And I guess they're working on a revised version of it. So yay.
Yeah. Part of your legacy.
For what it was, the fact that it's still around, it's kind of amazing. So I was there, and I wasn't feeling so good about things after about 5 years. We were getting close to launch, and I was just like, I'm not sure how long this is going to go after launch. And so I started looking around, and I think actually a recruiter reached out to me, or like, hey, are you looking? I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? And that's basically how I ended up with ZeniMax. I ended up getting an interview. I remember my first interview was with Zeb Cook, which no was kidding. I was like, Zeb Cook?
Right. I'd be like, whatever. You're not the Zeb Cook that impresses me, but go ahead and ask.
No, he was.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So that was basically how I got there. My last day at Icarus was supposed to be my going away lunch and everything, and I had to run out do something because we were moving, and I got a call. It was like, you need to come back right now. And I get back to the office, and they're in the process of laying off 80% of the company.
Whoa.
Yeah. So maybe I do have a little luck.
Yeah. Well, luck is the byproduct of effort, though, right? That's what they say.
Yep.
So
yeah. There were a lot of people who were like, did you know something? I was like, no.
What was it when you made a transition from, so going from tabletop to digital, what are some of the things maybe that were different?
Everything.
Okay. In a nutshell, what are some of the things that are different? What are some of the things that stand out maybe as different? And has that impacted or affected your tabletop design?
Sure. I'd say more of my tabletop design impacted my computer game design, but definitely. But I mean, it's a lot more technical. I am, as I mentioned, math, not my thing. And just generally, programming, not my thing. But you have to learn programming, to do a computer game, at least some degree of programming. You're using someone else's, systems, but you're having to plug everything in and know where to plug it in and all that. So, I had to learn a lot there. It was a steep learning curve on that. I think, just trying to think. I mean, because it really goes more for me, role-playing games into computer games, because there's not a whole lot that I took away from computer games for design. Other than maybe some player agency, and the idea of player agency, and making sure that the player has some control over what's going on in the world, which is a difficult thing to do in a computer game. Often it's something that we're always striving for. So the focus on that so much, I guess I kind of brought that back to role-playing games as well. I want the players to have control on their progression and their, with where they're going. So I guess that would be about all I can say on that.
What so you had mentioned that you felt a little burned out, or maybe a lot burned out. I guess a lot if you're leaving tabletop and going to digital, and then you do. Oh, go ahead.
White Wolf went through 3 rounds of layoffs. So
Right.
and some very close people got out on the first one. Then some other friends got outed on the second one, and then myself and a number of others were out on the third one.
Right.
Changeling was not the top selling game. So though interestingly, by today's standards for an indie studio, even on our worst day, Changeling was selling fantastically well.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of publishing, and I guess I'm thinking more of comics like these days, but I feel like a lot of publishing is like that. Stuff doesn't sell in the numbers that it used to sell that 30 years ago. Like it wasn't unheard of for comics to sell tens of thousands regularly, and then maybe even into the hundreds of thousands. And nowadays, they're really just sort of, I mean, I guess games are the same, because honestly, I don't look at the numbers.
It depends on the game. And like D&D sells millions. I mean, literally, they and when you look at the wedge of the market, it's 95% WotC, and then everybody else, and there's a lot of everybody else that shares that other 5-10% or whatever.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of the problem. Anybody who's not Wizards of the Coast is fighting for that wedge, and I think that wedge was a bit wider open back in the 90s. I don't know that Wizards TSR had half, had 80-90%, because you had FASA, just a lot of big names going around then, and White Wolf and such.
White Wolf,
but yeah, we used to sell tens of thousands. Even the lowest selling Changeling books tended to be in the tens of thousands, and now I would guess they would be in the maybe 1,000 to 2 or 3.
It's very specialized, and everything. So much today is just kickstarted, like these days, like so much. And I mean, I don't know. I assume that is just because it's easier to get at your market that way, because people are maybe looking for it, or it's more efficient, like more cost effective to do it that way. And I sometimes, I feel like that's maybe the model, at least for the foreseeable future, of like going forward and sort of breaking out. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself there, but because I do want to we're going to get to Nevermore here in a couple minutes, and what you're doing with the Kickstarter. But I do know that so after the digital stuff at Icarus and ZeniMax, and did you sort of feel refreshed and you went back to RPGs again? Is that when did you go back to Green Ronin? You went to Green Ronin, or?
Well, no, it was more, I just decided I didn't want to do computer games anymore, because I liked it. I loved it on some level, and especially Icarus, because I was working with so many amazing people, and actually I was working with amazing people at ZeniMax too, like Bill Slavicsek and Zeb, and some awesome people there, and not big name people who were awesome people that I really loved. But I'm not a technical person. I didn't enjoy that aspect of the job. I enjoyed creating the stories and designing things and all that, but that wasn't what most of my job was. Most of my job was sort of a glorified data entry in a way, the coding. And so yeah, I just, when I laid off from ZeniMax, I decided that I wanted to go back to tabletop games, because it's what I love. And I thought about it before, but for a long time, the tabletop role-playing game industry was in a slump. And I didn't see any real way of going back in. So what I did actually was I packed myself off to Gen Con, made a bunch of business cards, and just went table to table. Going, hey, I don't know if you remember me or not.
Right.
I was pleasantly surprised to see how many people knew who I was.
Right, of course.
That was cool.
Yeah.
After 12 years or whatever. But I basically just went around saying, hey, I'd like to get back into the industry. If you got any freelance, end up doing some stuff for Modiphius for Star Trek Adventures.
That's right. Yeah.
And I forget who else, for Green Ronin for Blue Rose.
Oh, another one I like. I love, like, I'm not doing this. This isn't advertising, folks. This is from my personal collection, by the way. All of this stuff is stuff I love.
Which Blue Rose needs more love too. It's a fantastic game.
Oh man, yeah, I love this.
Amazing.
Of course, I love the system. The system is pretty great. I like, and it does that thing that you were saying. It's tweaked, right? Because there's Fantasy Age, there's Blue Rose's version of Age, there's Dragon Age. Is that right? Dragon Age.
Yep. And the Expanse uses but they all do slightly different things with it.
Right.
Like the core is the same, but then they have things that expand on, like the churn for the Expanse is fantastic. But that was how I did it. I just went out and beat the and granted, I had a little bit of name behind me, but I'll say for anyone who wants to get in the industry, that's really getting face to face with people is the way to do it. Just get out there and let people know you're interested, and say, hey, I can, if you have something you've written, things that you've written that you can send off and things like that. But I was lucky with Green Ronin. Steve Kenson worked on Changeling back in the day, so he was the original developer for the Expanse core rulebook, but he knew me, and so I got to write a little bit for that, and then when Steve was going to go off and do other stuff for Green Ronin, they needed a developer for the Expanse, and so I got called up to do that. So,
and you ended up again being a developer, I assume, because you had worked at before, and you kind of now at this point you're no longer wet behind the ears. Like maybe with Changeling, it's just like, hey kid, get in there and make it good. And now this time they're like, this guy has done this before. Let's have him. What was it like working on? I mean, you're working on a licensed property at that point. Does that bring a whole separate set of concerns with it? Do you feel limited at all, or
see? There are two sides to that completely, and I think they both sort of cancel each other out in a way. But yes, you're limited because you have to keep it within that world. And the Expanse, even more so than Star Trek in a sense, because Star Trek you can do a lot of weird, wacky stuff, come up with new aliens, whatever. As long as they feel right, it's probably going to be okay. But with the Expanse, you're kind of limited in where you can go with that. They did not, we're based on the novels too, not the show. TV show, not the show. And so fortunately, I was already a huge fan. Had read all the novels up to where they were at that point. But so it limits you. But at the same time, you've got a track, right? You've got a lot of material to work with and bounce off of, which there's this thing that got mentioned in this book, and then so you can expand on it. Maybe just a company name that this, I don't know, anything. So there's just all kinds of stuff that you have to sort of spark ideas within that world. So you're limited, but then you also have stuff that you already have a groundwork to work with, because sometimes when you're going into the void, and there's nothing there, and you got to design something, that's scary too.
Right. Right. It's weird. It's just listening to you talk about it, and I might be wrong, but it sounds like it was an exciting experience, not just for the fact that you were working on the Expanse, but it sounds like it was exciting to you because it was something kind of different with a different set of rules to it. And I assume you're kind of learning some new things about how to draw, how to create new stuff based on whatever, based on this, based on that, and make things work in a way that maybe you hadn't been trying to make them work when you just had carte blanche to almost do whatever you want. I guess.
And that young, space engineer Ian got to come out with. I probably learned more about space science in the last few years.
Right. There you go. Well, hey, like you could go into we've all still have a chance within our lifetime to head into space. It might be a little expensive, but it looks like we've got a few different competitors.
Yep.
They're going.
Maybe one day. Who knows?
Maybe.
But, maybe.
How has it been like after all of working for the other people and being given assignments and not worrying about like the company going out of business or whatever. Well, maybe you are a little bit, but not so worried about having to. What's it like starting your own company? Because I guess, what was it like beginning of 2021? You kind of went off on your own, and why did you decide it had to go out on Nevermore had to be its own thing under you and not go to a publisher and go to Kickstarter? Like what's it been like making that transition?
I've wanted to do my own thing for a long time. I mean, and I've done a lot of really fun games, and I actually and the other one I recently I also designed Talisman Adventures for Pegasus Spiel, which is completely new system and everything. So sort of got that under my belt again. Okay, you're designing a system top to bottom, and I just always wanted to do that. I have a bit of an entrepreneurial spirit, I guess. I mean, I owned a game and comic shop, when I was like, you probably didn't find that one.
No, I'll have to check. My sources are not they don't run as deep as I thought.
There wasn't an internet when when I did that. So that would have been when I was like 19, 20. I had for about 2 years. So
wow.
I had a game and comic book shop for a while. And then of course starting the LARP thing. We did a LARP convention thing. We did that, and I've done a few other non-game related businesses and such, and so I enjoy that. I enjoy that challenge. So I wanted to do it on my own. I didn't want to have to be beholden to somebody else. I just wanted to create something entirely of my own.
How did Nevermore start? Did it grow out of like some sort of homebrew game you're running? Was it just something you'd been kicking around in your head for a while? Or did you say, you know what, I want to do my own thing. I got 5 ideas and I like this one best. Like, how did Nevermore come about?
Kind of the latter, even a little more organic than that, in the sense of when I went back into gaming, I decided at that point I wanted to do something on my own. That was my end goal. I was going back in to sort of brush up my chops and get my name known again, and all that, because I figured going in cold at that point, trying to put out a game would have been disaster. But I thought long and hard about what I wanted to do, and I had a lot of ideas that I really liked, but I was like, there's this game, it's pretty close, I don't know, there's this one, but that's and another one, and I really don't know why I didn't hit on it earlier, because like I said, I grew up reading Poe, and I used to catch the bus across the street from Poe's grave on the way back from work, and just sort of immersed in all that. And it's like, there's a lot of Gothic games out there, but there really isn't American Gothic. You have a lot of Victorian stuff, but it's all in Europe. You have Call of Cthulhu, but that's a little later. There really is nothing, as far as I could find, that's American Gothic. Now it seems as though this year, all of a sudden, there's like a half dozen games coming out.
It always happens. It's like the year of the body switching movies one year, then there was underwater sea monster movies another year, and it rains but it pours.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of us. Hopefully folks will like my concept. Fortunately, they all seem a little fairly different. I've looked at what other people are doing, and it's like, it competes because it, sort of the genre, but it's a very different style of game, so.
Well, that's, now keep in mind, sir, I'm an English teacher. I'd like to know,
Mhm.
can you tell me, in your own words, what is Nevermore, and what is American Gothic horror, and how is it different than other forms of horror or other forms of like Gothic adventures or Gothic periods? How would you put it into your own words?
You have your answer for this. maybe I should
You
get
have
to write
2
me.
minutes to answer, sir, and I'll be grading you.
The difference to me, and from what my understand, I mean, American Gothic sort of came from European, mostly UK Gothic, and that was sort of earlier. And then, of course, like everything in America, we sort of imported it a little bit later. So it's more the latter half of the 1800s instead of the first half. But they're both about that, that sense of fear and dread and horror, obviously. But British UK Gothic tended to be a little bit more about the monsters, about the creature itself. I mean, and if you look at the stories themselves, I mean, Dracula is very much about Dracula, not as much about the people, where American Gothic is a little more psychological, and a little bit more about that fear and dread and what's out there and that sort of thing. The creaking door and the shadow passing over the window, and that sort of thing. A little bit more uncertain about the horror. And I'll be honest, of course we have monsters in Nevermore. It's a role-playing game, you kind of gotta. But I am trying very hard to focus stories and the adventures that I'm writing for it, and the guidance for writing your own Nevermore tales, to be more about that mystery and discovery, than the actual confrontation with the monsters themselves. So that's an important aspect of it for me, and yeah. I hope that is a good 2 minutes.
No, no, I'm sorry. I was just kidding on that. That was
I know.
I thought that was so you're yielding your time back to. Never mind. That was a great answer. Thank you for that. Is there like an overriding kind of philosophy behind it? Or are you just like having some fun? You like the American Gothic genre. You like the time period. You like the feel, the atmosphere. Or is there some sort of philosophy behind it?
So one of the core aspects I sort of came up with early on was that this is more or less our world, but there are these places where bad things happen. But I was like, well, okay, so most of the historical figures are the same. Are there Gothic horror writers? How would that impact a world with actual things going on? And decided that they do exist, and they did exist, and they have existed, and that the people who investigate these places actually sort of look at these writers as almost prophets, whether or not they're seeing things that are, that are either in the world beyond, or, or making them happen themselves, maybe, is a question. But so that's sort of one of the, I think, the core conceits of the world. That yes, the American Gothic horror writers are there. They've written their stories, and in fact, in a couple of the stories they've written, the adventures they've written, you can use your knowledge of various stories to help solve the adventure.
That's great. I really like that idea. I mean, for me, I remember, to be honest, I think I was very much into like horror, and I was very much into just the idea of like Gothic and things like that, but I didn't quite put the pieces together when I was in school. And it was later on that I sort of realized that I had been reading a lot of American Gothic horror, actually, because I had some really great English teachers at my school. But like, I look back on things like, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and it doesn't quite seem like it at first, and it's very layered, and that style, that feeling, like you're saying, of sort of dread, of something imminent, kind of coming to change things. And of course, there's the metaphor of the white whale and all of that stuff, like things being out there. It kind of fits. To me, it sort of fits what you were saying before about America at that time. It was just recently, relatively speaking, settled, right? And so there were, like, most of the nation was still just empty. There wasn't much out there, really, relative to the way that obviously we are now. And so I like,
especially after we killed off the native population.
And it's right, yes, absolutely. And that idea of maybe manifest destiny that we sort of look back on now, and this idea of, just the idea of having manifest destiny sort of says that there's something out there that needs to be, this sounds awful, but it's the mindset, like something that needs to be eliminated and cleansed and then worked over. And that is very influential, I think, for the works at the books at the time. And it shows in the writing. Were there...
Right.
I think there are, and were there any writers in particular that were particularly? I assume Edgar Allan Poe, of course, but
Poe is the center of it. But I definitely pulled. Sleepy Hollow actually is one that I use the one passage from, and I'm not gonna, don't make me recite it, but it basically describes the area of Sleepy Hollow as this place where things happen, and people don't treat it the same way as they would elsewhere. Strange events will occur, and it's a sort of mystical place, and that sort of spawned the idea of these places, which I call Atheros, where where bad things happen, and where the mysteries take place. So that was a big influence. I'm just trying to think. Feelings and stuff. The yellow wallpaper was huge, just in its sense of that feeling of creeping uncertainty and dread throughout the whole thing. It's like, what's going on here? Why? Where am I? So yeah, it's hard to. Poe is at the center of it, but they're all out there. They're all in there to one degree or another.
You had mentioned, of course, that you feel that if the mechanics and the setting should sort of be a yin and a yang to one another. What are the mechanics like behind it? What sort of system are you using for Nevermore?
It's a card-based system instead of dice, for one. And I went around and around on that, and I couldn't come up with a dice system that felt right for it.
I love cards.
And one of my favorite games from back in the 90s was Castle Falkenstein, and it used cards. I'll be honest, I was never fully thrilled with the card system, but I loved the idea of the card system. I just felt like it just feels appropriate. You can sit around your living room, everybody has a deck of cards, and you can play sitting in your lounge chair or whatever, as opposed to, you have that sense of sitting around the parlor, as opposed to having to have a table in front of you to roll dice.
Interesting.
It's just just the tactile sensation of it just feels appropriate to me. And then there are other systems I tried to like. One of the important aspects of the game is the discovery system, which I call Revelations and Telltales. And throughout the game, you discover basically certain clues are labeled as telltales as you're going through the adventure. And there's guidance for game masters on which clues should be telltales. So basically anything where you're learning important information about what's going on. And at a certain point, you can use your telltales to have a revelation. And what it is sort of representing the character, the fact that the characters are in this story and you're not, and their head's going to be in that game, and they're going to be more aware of be able to put together the pieces. So it allows your character to sort of do that. And if you're successful in that, what it does is when you come to the thing, whatever it is that resolves the Atheros, whether it be, righting a wrong, or, burying a corpse, or destroying a relic, or what have you, you'll know. That's the thing we have to do. And then it also gives you some in-game effects as well, basically by sort of weakening the monsters and such a little bit, and maybe even taking some things away from the game master as well, the narrator. So it has an in-game effect and a sort of out-of-game effect. So
I love how what's interesting to me is that you just sort of mentioned that it could be righting a wrong. And it's interesting to me that that's the first thing that leapt out of your mouth, like when you're describing like an objective or whatever in the game. And again, I think this very much sort of follows that idea, or at least this trend that you sort of mentioned yourself, and that I think I see of like subtle, textured storytelling emphasis versus bombastic, loud stuff. And I love that. And I have to say that the cards were something that I was excited to hear about, because I think I saw on the Kickstarter it was saying that it was using cards, and that excited me. And then I went back and I was reading through your blog over the last year, and I thought there was some point, like some entry where you said, none of that works. We're not going to do that. I have to do something different, or something like that. And I wasn't sure if and I was like, what? False advertising. I thought, but then, okay, I'm so glad to hear that the cards.
Oh, it's still cards. It was just
wonderful.
The way I was doing the cards
was wrong.
That was wrong, and I had to do with the odds thing. I got some advice on how the odds were working out, and I just needed to change a whole bunch of stuff. And that's honestly, there are aspects of it that are going to be in playtest up until it goes into editing, which So.
Well, I was going to ask you, I know again from like reading through the blog and sort of looking back over how much work you've put into it. You have been running this at conventions, and I guess you've been playtesting it like I assume like with friends or with maybe even with foes, right? They might be better
and
to give you
Patreon too, and they people from the Patreon play with friends and in person. I haven't had as many in-person games as I would like here because of COVID. I did Gen Con and Origins online last year, but I actually did them physically this year.
Oh, cool!
And got to run some games in person, which was great.
How maybe so you've touched upon the idea of the card system changing, but can you tell us about one or two things that might have changed? And your laugh or your guffaw there tells me maybe a lot's changed through the playtesting period and over the last like year and a half that you've been developing.
So initially, the way that I deal with the psychological horror changed drastically. Initially, you sort of gained the dread as you dealt with certain things, which was cool because it was a little different than ways I've seen it done. But I also have another stat called grit, which is kind of your hit points, but you can also use it to increase your chances of success. When you're doing something, but you had these one stat that went down and another that went up, and I was just like, that doesn't really work. So I ended up changing that to courage, which just goes down the same way grit does. And then they both, when you reach the end of your grit, if you take damage, you take physical conditions, and then if you are out of courage and you take courage damage, shock, you suffer psychological conditions. So they parallel each other a lot more. So you sort of like, if you understand how one works, you understand how the other works. It's not a whole new system you have to explain to people.
They kind of complement each other, I guess, maybe.
Right. Yeah, they complement each other, and they parallel. The way they work is basically the same, with slightly different results at the end, but essentially works the same. So yeah, that was probably one of the big ones recently, like within the last 6 months or year. I may be making one more big one.
Hey, yeah, only makes it better.
Talk about yet?
Yeah.
Sort of combining some things as well, but simplifying basically. Most of what I've most of the changes I've made have been simplifications. It was like I had an overcomplicated system that I really liked, but it was too complicated. And why? You don't really need it. You have to sort of gauge how much is it giving the game, how much is it giving the experience to have this complicated system. And often the answer is you don't.
Right. Right. Well,
make it simpler.
It looks wonderful, and for those of you out there that haven't checked it out, you owe it to yourselves. I will put a link in the description to go check out the Nevermore Kickstarter. I think there are 4 days left on it.
9. We get 9.
Oh, 9 days. Okay,
eight as of tomorrow.
Okay, got it. You've already. It looks like you've doubled your. You've. I think you roughly doubled.
170. I think we're about 175%.
Okay,
that's where we are.
Cool. I'm so glad to hear that. Why do you think? Obviously the game is doing well. You're gonna get to publish it. You must be very excited. Why do you think? And you mentioned this before. Like if you look at the pie graph, like WotC is most of it, and then there's 5%. Why do you think there's been this kind of like surge and popularity in role-playing games in the last 5, 6, 7 something years? Like why? What's driving this, if something is, or is it just a fad for a while? Hopefully not.
I think if anyone could fully figure that out, they'd be able to make a lot of money. But I think, part of what sort of almost killed role-playing games is computer games. People got so much into computer games, and there was the new thing. And I think people, at least that I know, people that I know, started to miss that interaction with other people, that the collaborative storytelling, the doing things together. And you can play a computer game with someone else, but it's usually only maybe one other person, maybe an MMO, but you're not actually with them. You're not actually seeing their face. You're seeing, even if you're playing a role-playing game online, usually you're seeing each other's faces, hearing each other's voices. You're still interacting on that level. And I think people started to miss that. It's my guess. At least that's one aspect of it. D&D 5th edition didn't hurt either. That was a big, and it was good. I think that's the thing, or better than it had, the last bits had been. And it brought back a lot of people who hadn't been playing. Everybody, I will not put down anything that anybody else likes, but personally, 4th edition was not for me. I stopped playing D&D, because I just didn't have any interest in it. 3.5 got to be the point. It started to get so complex too. It became hard. It was more of a miniatures game, and I felt like 5th brought back some of the magic. At least for a lot of people. It's sort of, it's still simpler, but like 4th, but yet also brought in some of the weirdness and crunchiness of 1st and 2nd edition. And I think that helped a lot, that resurgence of D&D, and then the actual plays and such really took off. And, who would have thought people would be watching people play D&D?
It's interesting. It's interesting because every once in a while, I do actual plays myself, and I love to do actual plays. They're fun. They're really fun to just sit here. I don't really watch a lot, though. I like to do them. They're really fun, and there've been a few that I've kind of followed. It's interesting what you said about 5, though, because 5e, because my interest in games was there, but my participation and my passion maybe had been petering towards, and it was probably at its lowest just before 5e came out. And then when 5e came out, I don't even know what it is. I was going to ask you, what do you think it was about 5e that, you sort of said it, but I think other things are happening too. What was it about 5e that brought things rocketing back?
I know for me anyway, I can only speak for myself, right? It had, just looking at it initially, it was like, oh, these are things I remember from 2nd edition, that got thrown to the wayside, spells and things like that, wish spell, fourth edition, it was gone, and which, yeah, I realize it's a difficult spell to deal with, but just the fact that they brought that back, and I can't remember the other things, but there were just other little things like that. It's like, oh, this looks cool. And then they had enough new to it too.
Yeah.
Just some new tweaks to it and things. It was like, not only is it, what I remember, and I have that nostalgia aspect, it also has some cool new stuff,
Yeah, I was going to say,
there's a good balance.
There's something about it that was cool. It's hard to describe, and it was cool to revisit something I'd played years before and always had fun with, but it was just cool. And what's funny is
I should also say the art for me.
The art was the art was very beautiful.
Fourth went into the looking like MMO characters and everything, looked so unrealistic. And they also got rid of the problematic issues of all the previous editions of female armor, women just wore armor, not this weirdly, bearing the midriff or whatever, so it just had this nice feel to it, and I felt like they were thinking about what they were doing with the art, and so that's important. Art's huge.
I would definitely say so. It's interesting because that is true. Like, I remember looking at it and I was like, oh, because I love the art for 4. I love the art for all of them, but there was something about 5 that kind of started a new kind of thing. There was a new kind of trend. Fresh. And what's interesting to me, though, is that I played it for about a year, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. But I just realized, I was just like, my goodness, there are so many other games too. This is great. And I wanted to play so many other games. It was really, really interesting. But what do you think? And of course, I know from talking to you, what do you think it would take to widen that little slice of pie for the other publishers and genres? I often feel like there's something. I love D&D, and I always have to start what I'm saying by saying I love D&D. It's been a lifelong love.
Well, yeah.
But I would, as an English teacher or as a nutritionist, I would never tell someone, you should eat pizza every single day, 3 times a day for your whole life. And as an English teacher, I would never tell someone, oh, you should just read Dan Simmons science fiction forever. You need to read outside your genre. How do we get, or how do we change, or how do we help people play outside their genre? What do you think it would take?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I think it's going to take it's going to take some of the sort of luminaries in the scene to lead people in that direction, because so many people get what they're what they're consuming from Critical Role and some groups like that. The problem is they're financially tied in with Wizards of the Coast,
right?
So they're never going to break away from that. But if something were to happen, and say some of those people ended up going off and doing something else and started showcasing indie games or something, I think, if Matt Mercer was to start doing, independent games,
right,
that could make a huge difference. You're going to need a star. You're going to need probably some star power, or someone new, someone, an actor or something, because you have so many different actors and such going into doing these actual plays and stuff, but they all do D&D
right
every single time. It's like, oh, great, more D&D.
Right.
I mean, again, I love D&D. It was,
yes.
It will always be.
Ladies and gentlemen, we love D&D. Just D&D. So you know, we do. We
just want a little bit. a little more of a crack.
Well, I honestly think, I hope to see a day when, as an English teacher, I would never tell someone, and my teachers told me, Matt, you have to put down the Stephen King book at some point and pick up something by Herman Melville, or you have to be willing to try, Anthony Burgess or whoever. And I feel like you need a healthy diet of just about everything in your life. And I think there are some people out there that might not have discovered, oh, actually, I really like playing in science fiction, or I like playing in American Gothic, or I like playing in in the like the Pleistocene era or some, I don't know what it is, but there could be
Right.
any number of different genres, eras, or styles that they enjoy, and they just quite don't know it because all they've had is D&D. But I love D&D. We both love D&D. We love
We
it.
both love D&D.
Let me ask you this then, because you've been very generous with your time, and we've gone a little bit over here, but the Kickstarter is a success. It's doing well. I'm so excited for that because that means I'm going to get myself another cool game. Can't wait to try it out and take a look through it. What are your future plans for Nevermore, or is it just ginging across the finish line at this point? Like, have you thought beyond that yet, or?
Yes.
Okay.
I have. I mean, first off, we have a whole lot of stretch goals that we've already hit a bunch of them. The expansions to the book, adventures, a narrator's kit. We're going to we're the next one, which I'm really excited about and really want to do, is a really nice fold out map, 1880s map of Baltimore City, which is the core setting for the game. And then I want to do the next one after that, some props and such like that, and then some VTT support. But yeah, so there's a lot of stuff like that, just supportive stuff. I have ideas for Beyond, sort of a companion to Nevermore, because I mean, Nevermore is very much firmly set in American East Coast.
Yeah.
And it was in Baltimore City because it's in between, and I grew up there. A little bit of both, but you know, it's not northern, it's not southern, it's a nice in between. Poe lived there for a good, well, died there, so it has a lot of connections. But there's a whole rest of the country too, and things could be very different out there.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, so you could do some interesting Gothic-ish stuff with other parts of the country, perhaps. So I'm not going to go too far into that.
Well, I appreciate the hints at that. I'm greatly looking forward to the release of the game. I was really excited, and as I said, and I've said before repeatedly, I don't bring people on for advertising. I don't bring them on because they're necessarily super popular. I don't bring them on because they're like whatever. I bring people on because they have cool, awesome stuff that I think is worthy of checking out, and it caught my attention, and I think they have interesting things to say. So, Ian, I really appreciate you coming on and spending a few hours with me. I very much appreciate it, and thank you so much for that.
Thank you for having me. This has actually been really enjoyable.
I'm glad.
Good talk.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad to hear that. That means maybe I'll get another interview subject.
Sure.
So for those of you that are watching at home, and I know there were some comments, so I know that Michael Lynch was in the chat and he was asking about some things. Those questions that you have, Michael, are actually answered a little bit back. I know you joined us late, but thank you very much, everybody out there, for watching. As I mentioned before, I am going to be back on this coming Sunday. I'll be with Anthony Fernandez of the Cypher Unlimited crew. We're going to be running, we'll be doing an episode of GMs in the Machine, and it's a lot of fun. For 2 hours or sometimes a little bit longer, I will sit down with the GM and we just develop a game, and we come up with a one-shot or a setting or something like that. Anthony's idea was he wanted to combine, and they're kind of similar, but Planet of the Apes with Logan's Run. So we're going to try and come up with a game for Cypher System for that. And if you can, like and a subscribe always helps. I cannot get people like Ian to come on a program which nobody watches and nobody subscribes to. Though he's very nice. He probably would. If my subscribers went, he's been very nice to me. I'll bet he would, just because he felt sorry for me. But the more subscribers, the more likes, the more shares. If you see an interview you really like, please do think about sharing that. But from all of us here at MML and at Role Player with 1,000 Faces, thank you very much for tuning in tonight. We very much greatly appreciate your viewership. Have yourself a great game, and stay safe. I'll see you on the next episode.